everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of Beyond the Alert. Today I'm speaking with Al Faiella, Director of Security Engineering at ThoughtSpot. Al, thanks for chatting with me today.
Very happy to be here.
So I'm going to dive right in because you have lots of insights to share with our audience. When you're thinking about AI and threat detection, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that security leaders have?
I think there's at least, three things that come to mind. Like, I think first is probably thinking about how do you measure success? Yeah, I think there's a large historical pedagogy around metrics, how to think about both how are we responding in terms of speed, how are we responding in terms of volume, how are we responding in terms of coverage. And I think that there is a lot of value within a lot of those common metrics, whether it be you're measuring again like your mean time to response, mean time to user detection, kind of the life cycle of an incident overall. But, I think that they often maybe hide some of the reality, right? I think asking yourself the question constantly, like, am I looking for or actually even looking at the right things is really important to always be asking yourself. And I think sometimes we rely too heavily on metrics as a whole to try to answer that question. So I think that's certainly something I like to think about and something I definitely encourage others to think about when evaluating your program, whether or not you feel as if you have the right pieces of the puzzle in front of you, and also do you have the right tooling to be able to sift through those puzzle pieces. So that's definitely one thing. I'd say secondarily too, I definitely think there is, especially in this contemporary moment, right? I think maybe a misconception that doing things the same way as we have been for a long time, is the right approach, right? I think we're definitely in this like beautiful moment where technology, process, and I think really kind of the future of technology as a whole, right, is kind of intersecting. And I think that figuring out ways to incorporate things like agentic AI, or I would say just broadly kind of LM technology as a whole, into how you operate is not no longer kind of a nice to have; it's a necessity. So I think really trying to figure out how to fit that into your program, I think is really critical. And I would say lastly too, right? I think, and this maybe comes more from the experience both as a practitioner now and also as a leader is I think having some empathy for what it's like to be on the front lines for sure, right? I think most security leaders in this space I think have at least at some point or another actually been in the chair trying to respond in real time to the many things that go blink throughout the day and throughout the night. So, and that's constantly evolving. It's a very stressful and b honestly very challenging work. And I think making sure that as you approach these types of programs, whether it be a large organization or a smaller one, is thinking about what does this actually look like then for me as a responder, as me as an analyst, as an engineer. How do we incorporate that into how we think about building our program holistically? So definitely something that I like to think about.
Touching on a lot of really important threads there. For assessing an AI solution, especially with having that practitioner experience as well, what do you need to tell your team to kind of get them on board, or do they see this as an ability to kind of up level, right? Because now they can get rid of the repetitive stuff that's just causing them to burn out. What does that conversation look like?
Yeah, so I think at least here at ThoughtSpot, I'm very lucky where we have a leadership team that has really embraced AI as a concept, also very much, I think baked into our product and our even our genesis to some extent, right? So I think philosophically, right, we come to this topic with I would say open arms, right? So I think that's something I necessarily don't have as much of a challenge with at a vertical level as perhaps some other organizations do. So I think that's like, of course, really important. It's worth mentioning that. But when it comes to both either building our own products, which we've done a fair amount of here at ThoughtSpot, which is great, and also even assessing things out in the market, I think fundamentally it comes down to really being able to identify where there's value. And now, value, what exactly is that, right? I think that's a lot. We often say that a lot, but what do we really mean when we say that? I think I would look at value as being a function within itself, right? You're kind of thinking about how do I get time back into my life? How do I get time back into the hands of my analysts, my engineers? Because what can that time do? That time can then be used to do a different project, to do career development, to honestly even just take a breather, right? We talked about kind of even just like the difficulty and stresses of this job, right? I think being able to mitigate burnout is really important. So that's some of where I think that the value that we're looking for in these evaluations are kind of derived from, or really kind of how to measure to some extent. But also too qualitatively, right? Is the product actually being able to deliver on what they're setting out to do? I have maybe a bit of an interesting take on that. I dislike the use of the phrase AI in general. I mean, I use it every day. We all use it, right? But I think it's a bit of a sleight of hand when we talk about what exactly are these technologies really doing. And, at the end of the day, like they are obviously very powerful, incredible statistics machines, right? And I think that not losing sight of that, I think, is really important as we're both assessing how to bring things into our environment, our ecosystem, and also what role we want them to play. Because I think it's a really important part of the story.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about AI because you try to avoid the term because it can mean so many things, right? and already it's becoming the hottest buzzword. So every security vendor out there is AI forward, AI native, bolted on AI, right? So I can only imagine how painful it is for all of you to try to understand in that mess, what are the solutions that can truly help? What are some of the biggest challenges you face when trying to implement such a solution, right? Because there is the marketing speak, everything looks the same. So how do you know kind of what to shortlist and not waste your time?
Actually, I think the best way to answer this question is actually almost by asking and answering another question, which is, if I were to build this myself, what would it look like, or what would I expect it to do? And like that's actually something that we've done, a fair amount of here at ThoughtSpot, is where we've done a series of internal to our own secure engineering function, AI based hackathons, right? 30 days or less, build something cool that either automates something that you're doing today or that you think we're not doing that we should be. And we've had some really great results out of that work effort. Now, what's been fascinating though is like taking that amazing idea or that amazing product. Maybe it was, vibe coded over a weekend, or maybe it was, sketched out and architected all within a couple of days, and now running it as a production service, right? A lot harder than it sounds necessarily, right? And in this way, I think that like the old saying is, there's nothing necessarily new under the sun. I think you're seeing a lot of the same challenges or problems you would have with build versus buy decision making. I think within the AI world as well. So to circle back to them, like how do we, then I guess think about evaluating those key functions or capabilities out in the market, right? It's first asking ourselves like, well, if I were to do it, how would I tackle this problem, or what would be kind of the key functional goals I would want to have? Second, how would I at least conceive of how this would fit into my existing workflow, and what would it perhaps replace? And then as a tertiary point too, right? And this is a big part of this, right? Is certainly trust, right? I think right now in the market, right, there is a ton of products, as you've mentioned, right? A ton of folks that are rushing to slap AI with on top of their products, or even within their products, wherever it might be. But ultimately, also too, like, do you trust folks to be able to build this securely and safely as well? Right. I think a lot of technology is still very young. So, even within the security community itself, as much as I love seeing like new shops come up with, I think, innovative ways to challenge historical problems, it's still a matter of being thoughtful about too. Like, am I ready to, trust a 3-month old company with, some of my most sensitive, let's say, threat intelligence data? Or do I really trust them to be a integral part of how I view IR here, whether it be at, Air ThoughtSpot or anywhere else, right? So I think it's certainly not easy, but I do think that like when you at least try to build first, it informs how you think about going to market for solutions or capabilities in general.
For sure. And if you weren't so AI forward as an organization, if you pick the wrong technology and it's not what it's supposed to do, right? And it sucks, then you're losing that trust with your team as well in terms of what AI could potentially do. So on that note, to you, what is the difference between AI hype and actual AI value when it comes to security operations?
I've been kind of everywhere on the scatter plot of like assessing this myself. Just, right. I think kind of like a similar function of the Dunning Kruger effect. I think, you asked me this question a year ago, I would have probably been fairly skeptical about where I saw AI fitting. And, here I am using the phrase AI, right? Where I see AI fitting within the security operations world, right? Go forward 6 months, earlier this year, I think I was kind of a little bit more on the hype train, definitely an optimist. And now I'm kind of more in that trough of being, I think, like kind of cautiously optimistic, right? Where I see AI or agentic capability largely as being supplementary to, I think, a lot of the ops that we do today, whether that be within the threat detection space, whether it be even like in the vulnerability management space or other areas of security operations overall, and ideally too, at least being a vehicle for accelerating processes as opposed to replacing them in full. Because one thing I think about too, right, is, and I'm certainly not the first one to say this, but I think it's important to note is, right, is that I worry about the kind of offshoring or kind of like the knowledge as a service functionality of AI to some extent, where once you almost outsource the thinking, outsource the basic mechanics of a lot of ops, you lose then kind of the key intuitions that drive why is this op even important, or what does good even look like, right? A part of me almost wonders, right, was the hours, months of my life spent looking at false positives, was that actually really fundamental and foundational to how I look at current atomic events or current alerts, right? Because I've looked at 10,000 things that are wrong or perhaps not interesting. So I know when I see the one thing that is interesting, I know why, or also I know what to do next. So I wonder if that's perhaps taking away from some of like, or that might be robbing to some extent the, maybe future folks that are entering cybersecurity, or even folks that are in their career now, where we might be losing that ability to kind of inject our own thoughts, our own kind of framework into what is could be, a full loop, autonomous thinking, So I think when I think about, again, like injecting this within our world today, right, is that viewing it less as like a be all end all within itself and truly as an instrument to accelerate or at least, expedite things that we're already doing today. Now, I'll say just as a final point, right, I definitely think that the future here is going to move more and more towards closing that loop, right? I think that is certainly an inevitability, but I think that's where then the challenge is always going to be is making sure that you still know or you still have your hands on the wheel either as a leader, even as a tactical person, day in, day out. Do I still know what's actually happening underneath this black box? Right. Because, as we continue to abstract away, the less we actually understand what's actually happening within that black box. And that I'm definitely worried about.
For sure, especially in cyber. That's not something that makes you comfortable, right?
That's certainly right.
Yeah, and it's been a really hot topic for our target or our audience, frankly, of the podcast because yes, it saves so much of the redundancies and the burnout, right? And you don't necessarily want to spend 5, 10 years looking at every alert and knowing that it's just piling up behind you because you cannot keep up. But then how are you training those entry level candidates, right? Do you have them look at the investigation report output from AI? Do you take it away from them for a year and say, go fish? It's a really interesting debate because you can use it as a thought partner, but we all know even when we're kids, right? If we're looking at an answer in a quiz, we're more likely to look at the answer before thinking through the whole problem, right? So it's really, really interesting to see where that world is headed.
It's a great question, and one, I have thought a great deal about. Right now, at least we don't have any immediate, I think plans to hire anyone within our group. So it's been something I haven't had to answer tactically yet. But if I were, I think I'd almost think of it similar to perhaps almost like an RPG style, almost unlock, right? So imagining you're playing a World of Warcraft, if you will, right? And perhaps you can't use this nice shiny sword until you're level 10, right? Yeah, is maybe the poor analogy I would use here. But I think that really I would want to see folks at least go through and understand how to do things, perhaps air quotes the old fashioned way. So also it gives them an appreciation of what does it mean to simply enrich an IP, with a single, plain text query into like your LLM du jour, right? Or what does it actually mean to try to or at least attempt to correlate events from disparate log sources without the aid of an LLM, right? What would be some of the questions you'd want to ask yourself? Would be some of the things you'd want to do tactically? Because I think without that kind of understanding, it makes even interacting with AI technology harder, right? I think usage these days seems to have gone down, at least as far as I've seen. But this entire concept, right, of prompt engineering, right? How do I thoughtfully or expertly actually use this thinking machine to get out what I want, right? There's definitely a qualitative nature to that, and I think you can only really have that qualitative capability or in terms of like being able to actually get the thing, for lack of a better phrase here, right, to do what you want is by actually knowing what that is, like very much on your own, right, with some level of expectation. So I do think that there would be ideally a almost a boot camp, a manual phase of that onboarding experience, and then once you pass that, then I think you can kind of use the golden gun, so to speak. But until then, right, I think that's a really important part of the process.
I think that's a fantastic approach and give you something else to tackle. You can set the benchmark for this
I would definitely like that.
since you have lots of time on your hands, right?
Well, especially now with all my autonomous agents that are running 24/7, that's right.
I have to ask you this and play devil's advocate. I think it's so funny as a marketer to say, "How do you feel about an autonomous sock?"
It's I think it's kind of derivative of what I've maybe or at least already alluded to here, right? Where I think that like the idea sounds great. I think fundamentally, right, this is the direction I think every security operations function needs to go towards is at least introducing more levels of autonomous ability or capability into your world. But I do worry about like, air quotes truly a fully autonomous sock, right? I think that is like a certainly a misnomer, and B, I think something that actually we would want to probably like avoid in like the truest of sense. Now, do I see this perhaps being a great supplement or complement to how folks operate today? Absolutely, and I think that's true today. Yeah, I think 12 months from now, could it even be more so? Yes, I definitely think so, right? I think that outside of us actually achieving to a more meaningful level, kind of a true definition of AI as we kind of understand it, I think even the technologies of today, right, are only going to get better. Contextualization is going to become easier to do, right? Enrichment is going to be easier to do, and I do think that that's going to play a very large role in addressing what is, major problem today, right? Is of course like alert fatigue or just kind of like the burnout effect of having to look at 10,000 blinking lights, a week, a month, a year. So I definitely, I think I buy the future, but I think I sell perhaps maybe the explicit usage of some of the language. But I definitely think that the future is going to be largely driven by a series of agents that are all performing various discrete tasks. And then it will become much more focused on you as an analyst, you as an engineer, not only building these agents, but also orchestrating them in a meaningful way to achieve, your own business outcomes. So I think that's definitely the future.
For sure. And sorry, I had to throw that your way, and it was a trick question. We use it people search for the term, so we do use it on our website, but we don't believe in a fully autonomous SOC.
Well, and that's part of the beauty of it, right? Is like even being able to help like educate or even like communicate with the community in real time, right? I think that this stuff is really just all so new, right? Like the joke, right, is you see job descriptions out there for 5 years of MCP, server experience, right? This stuff is all so new, and I think we're all still trying to figure out a like how do we use it ourselves as security practitioners, but also b then also how do we secure it too. So there it is kind of a full circle there. So I think it's great to be able to talk about it and to also kind of like figure it out. Like this is literally the tip of the spear as far as I'm concerned. And it's really exciting.
Yeah, a lot of new ground to forge for sure, especially in how to secure AI. And I think that's where the prompt engineering comes back into play as well, right? You need to understand how to secure those technologies and how to see if something there's a red flag and how it's functioning.
Yeah, and I think too the ecosystem for even tooling that will support these kind of core objectives or initiatives or even like securing AI within itself. I think that ecosystem is going to get deeper and richer and also more effective. I think over time, and honestly faster than we probably even think. Right. I think the past 12 months have been incredible. Right. Even just thinking about the RSA feels like a year ago. Right. Black hats this week, and I've been hearing a lot of amazing things coming out of there too. And I think that the ecosystems are just going to get deeper and honestly just like more capable. And then, I think really then like kind of brings, this little full circle back to even the beginning of the conversation where then it becomes really incumbent on security leaders to think about what is the right strategic direction for me that I think is, somewhat future proof. And also I think scales with where I think that my business needs are, right? How's that tied back to my risk register? How's that tied back to what are kind of my core objectives, both perhaps from a security standpoint, but also from a business perspective as well. And being able to at least like chart out that future. I think the days of having like a 2 or 3 year roadmap to me, I think are kind of over. Especially in the moment we are in now, where you might have to scrap everything you thought was going to happen 6 months from now. 3 months from now. So I think that that's also like something just to keep in mind, and for folks, I think just to accept.
For sure. The era of rewriting playbooks, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned something really interesting. So, with orchestration of all of these agents in the future, have you given any thought to that? How you would go about that or how that would change the SOC?
Yeah, and I think this is a kind of a great example too, of where like the buy versus build question comes into play, right? Where I've conceived of how I would think about architecture, at least designing this to some extent, right? But then building it, maintaining it, and perhaps also improving it, right, then becomes like the real name of the game. And I'll say just kind of as a as a sidestep here, I think even conceiving of even the definition of an agent to me has been a fascinating kind of endeavor, right? I think Google's A2A protocol is like the closest thing I've seen so far to really kind of give it shape and function. And I think that that's something that I think like makes very much intuitive sense to me. Is something I use conceptually, but also literally to think about like what does like an agentic mesh of the future look like. But I think we're all still kind of figuring that out, right? I think and like that's where I think too, right? I think services or products that are thinking about that architecture now, where they can either deliver that as a service, be able to provide even just the platform for you to then be able to build and orchestrate and design your own agents, I think is going to be really important. But then critically, just the skill set within itself, I even just being able to conceptualize and find the right level of atomic, I guess, direction for your specific agents is going to be, I think, a really big thing for the future, right? So I think in that regard, I think everyone's going to kind of become, in my mind, kind of their own product manager. I say this to my team, almost every day, right? Is that think of yourself as being your own product manager when it comes to designing and orchestrating how you think an automation should work, or being able to conceive of how to inject new capabilities into your current work streams that you think are inefficient or that are overly manual, right? So that's how I think about it today. And I do think that like right now, like whether you're using kind of more persona based bots within like things like, kind of your off the shelf Claude or Chat GPT, or if you're actually designing, defining, and building objects that I would kind of really call agents, right? I think that it's all kind of in the same umbrella. And I think that as time goes on, this space will within itself find a little bit more shape. But I think that's also too where I think, folks that are entering the market on the product side, I think they have a lot of green grass to be able to kind of both define what good looks like, but then also offer teams either the tools to build themselves or at least even a starting point. I almost think about, kind of, typically, right? Let's say you were to buy a new scene tomorrow, right? It comes preloaded with, let's say 150, thousand detections, right? I imagine that kind of similarly happening in the future where you'll have a series of agents that are kind of like predefined in some respect that are common across many use cases. And, that could be a huge way for, I think, an entrant to kind of get to market and really be able to say, hey, like this is the right way to do this. Or here's a model, a framework for you to model your own usage off of.
And so in terms of that, how do you measure today with not having a baseline, right? How are you looking at these AI tools or even something you're building in-house with AI, and how then do you talk about the ROI or effectiveness or the outcomes? Is it time-based or is it consolidation of tech stack? What does that look like?
I'll say I think in a perfect world, it should ideally be fairly time based. Thinking about being able to say that if you were to assume, let's say, a given alert takes anywhere from, let's say, 15 to 30 minutes to evaluate, right? I think that's probably a very liberal number in terms of time spent, right? But let's say you were to make some hard assumptions, right? And then you were to do some basic math, and then how that could then be mitigated, expedited, or largely kind of at least addressed by a new agentic tool, right? That's a very straight line path to at least being able to assess or measure ROI. We don't live in that world. At least I can say, at least I don't think most shops are quite there yet. So to me, right, I think that it is a combination of qualitative, I think, kind of assessment, right? Like a little bit squishy, but I think like most things wind up being squishy at the end of the day anyway. As much as we all like to say we're data driven, I think a lot of decisions winds up still being fairly intuition driven. So I think that's a big part of it. Seeing like, is there actually like a qualitative benefit in terms of maybe the quality of an investigation, the I would say the overall sentiment perhaps of the folks who are actually performing these investigations. Like, is this actually making their lives better, right? Even just qualitatively, right? I think that's enough for me to some extent. Then I'd say lastly too, right? Like the biggest part here is just then you as a team, is my velocity actually improving, right? At a macro level. I think that's the easiest way for me to think to try to measure this. At least how I've tried to think about it myself. And I think so far the answer is yes. Certainly, I think what the expectations have certainly moved, right? Like from a leadership standpoint, like even like, vertically all the way up to the C-suite. I think that, there's a lot more expectation now to move faster because you're more capable. There's kind of the operative assumption. And I think, right, I think what's going to separate, I think team to some extent for the future is those who buy into that narrative or at least say, yes, that is kind of like the expectation and also the norm I'm going to set. Or folks that, I think say that that's not how we're going to operate. And I think, look, I don't think necessarily one is better than the other. I think it's fine to say that we are still going to take a very systematic approach to how we move, and we're going to do things very thoughtfully, and perhaps like wait and see like where AI fits into like the future of the future security team. But I think if you're not doing it today, I think you run the risk of losing out on a lot of that institutional knowledge or kind of that ability to see a new technology really evolve. And getting back to another thing we've already talked about is just I think the hands-on experience of using it, that is going to be invaluable because I think 12 months from now, 18 months from now, if everything becomes as abstracted as I think it might become, then if you don't even know how the black box works, then you are, I think, going to be in trouble. So I think the ROI is definitely tough to measure. Ideally, you always want to look at it with as much data as possible. But I think that the macro will be much easier to look at in terms of just what is your team actually able to do velocity wise. And I can say, like, right, at least for us, I know that our velocity is definitely increased, and I expect that to continue.
For sure. Yeah. When you talk to your peers, do you find that a lot of them are building stuff with AI in-house, or what are you hearing there that's kind of aligned with your thought process or surprising to you since you are so AI forward?
I think it's a bit of both. Yeah, I think there's a bit of a selection bias, both in what you might see out on LinkedIn or on Twitter about folks talking about the new thing that they've just built or the thing that they've vibe coded over the weekend, right? Or slapped together that is this like really neat, capable product. And like those things are great, honestly, right? We've done some of those things in house, like we've talked about. But I do think at least right now, there's still also a lot of folks that are still, I think, either looking for products to purchase or at least to bring in house that are already pre-built. We're also looking for the existing vendor space to level up into these spaces, right? I think that's going to be, I think, a major trend I see, right? Is that, for companies that have maybe perhaps like rush to kind of slap AI into their product, like at least for like this first wave, right? Maybe it's like some basic chatbot functionality. Maybe it's some basic, data upload capability that you're able to then leverage an LLM for some type of operation, right? Like that's all well and good. But I think the next wave and probably even the wave after that of productization will be really where the kind of the laboratory experiments that we're seeing today, right, that might be big in the security world or in the security community might transition to being, I think, more like enterprise grade products as well. I think that's where I think I'm going to see. I would expect to see more adoption. That's kind of what I'm hearing, and also what I'm seeing, because then it goes back to that 4 letter word, right? Trust. So 4 letters. Yeah, I hope so. But anyway, yeah, I think like that's also I think a big part of it, and yeah, I think I know there's a lot of big players in this space that are trying to rush to that kind of goalpost like as fast as possible, but I wouldn't. I trust that those big players will do that effectively and securely, and I think that building will become something that is very niche, and also I think that will probably be less common, I think, in the future, despite maybe what the air quotes, kind of the tabloids might say today, because building and managing this stuff actually is very time consuming. At least personally, I think so. And just truthfully, too, right? What is new is happening so fast that investing in something, even if it's internal, right, could become outdated and almost immediately. So I think that being agile, being I think kind of external, looking at least for what is out there is a really key part of I think future proofing yourself, but also being able to enable your teams, at least even today with the capabilities that they need.
Awesome. If you could give security leaders one piece of advice about preparing their teams for the next wave of AI and cyber, what would that be?
I'd probably say, just anticipate being wrong to some extent, right? I think I'm a fairly Socratic person. I think I often start with the assumption that I'm wrong about whatever I'm thinking or what I'm doing, and then I try to prove myself right effectively. And I think that's going to be an important thing for everyone to keep in mind as we're going through the next couple of months and years here in this wave of agentic capability, because ultimately, right, like I think the speed is going to outpace our ability to honestly deploy and maintain. I think that's certainly true. That's kind of thematic what we've talked about. I also think that too, right? I think while I think fundamentally AI is still a similar product space than any other, but to some extent, right? I think there's kind of divide there too around what does AppSec mean for AI products? How is that different, or is it at all than anything else? But I think that because of the speed, I think that those are going to be questions that we have to still ask ourselves, or at least I think be open to at least interrogating. And I think just making assumptions, right? I think is going to be a poor decision, or at least trying to make assumptions about how things work or how to do things is going to be certainly something you want to avoid in this future world. And like last year, right, kind of tying this all together, in terms of just being open to being wrong, is that I think that too we are in a moment too where I think folks that are coming up into the space with this as being kind of like their first touch of technology, perhaps are going to have a better view of it than let's say I even do. Right. And so I think even just as a leader, right, just being open to hearing different perspectives from every level of seniority on your team, and ultimately like realizing that I think that the board is changing, and that is I think that is an unavoidable conclusion. So if you can go into it with an open mind, I think that's the best thing you can do.
For sure. Sounds like your team is lucky to have you. It's been bugging me the whole episode. I have to ask about the medals on your wall.
Yes. So this is a New York City Marathon. This is 2021. I was supposed to run it in 2020. Unfortunately, something happened in 2020. Little thing called COVID. This other one here is actually a bit of a joke. My wife and I ran a loop just around Central Park, and we gave ourselves ribbons. So those are my two favorite medals. Yeah.
Cool. I'm not a runner, but I always admire runners. So thank you for sharing. There's one thing you can relate from your running and sports to your role. What would it be?
Don't sprint a marathon. You will not make it, right? Kind of the Simon Sinek concept of the infinite game, right? Where especially in security, I think very tough for you to sprint a marathon. Don't burn yourself out, right? I think it's very easy to. I know what we do is challenging all on its own, and it carries with it this sense of responsibility, right? Where you constantly want to ensure that you're doing what you can to protect your organization or wherever you might be working. But I think that's definitely something I take to heart. I certainly can't sprint marathons, and I try to remind myself that when maybe I have that long day, and I'm like, hey, you might need to take an hour or two for yourself. So I would definitely say that translates.
Awesome. It certainly takes an empathetic leader to understand that burnout is real and to take care of your team because it takes a village, right?
Absolutely, couldn't put it any better myself.
On that note, it has been such a pleasure speaking with you, Al. Where can people find you, connect with you, and learn more about you?
So you're happy to connect with me on LinkedIn, Alessio Faiella 35 there, and then otherwise, I believe I also have a Twitter at Al_Faiella if you want to find me there. Otherwise, always happy to chat about things that you might be working on or things that you might find interesting here that we discussed. Otherwise, really just love being part of the security community. I think it is a marvelous group of people that are, I think incredible to talk to. Everyone comes from different perspectives, different backgrounds. So don't be a stranger.
Awesome. Thank you so much for jumping on and sharing all of your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.